I'm going to make a bold statement in this video that all paper is doomed to fail, at least as a store of value. I'll back this statement with a fairly straightforward high-level argument. Follow along with me and see if you agree. Let's start by considering the total population of the world, and we'll divide them into a group of debtors, who consume more than they produce, and a group of savers, who produce more than they consume. Now, if we include every living person into one group or another, we have a closed system. At any point in time, in this closed system, there will be goods that are produced, and there will be goods that are consumed. In general, the amount of goods that are produced are approximately equal to the amount of goods that are consumed. Yes, it is true that durable goods and capital equipment are created each year, but it is also the case that at the same time, previously produced durable goods degrade, and older capital equipment wears out. For the most part, the rate of consumption and the rate of production are equal. This makes sense because business owners in general will not produce more or fewer goods than they think they can sell. This is not to say that some people don't produce a surplus over and above what they consume. The savers do just that. What is the motivation of the savers to produce more than they consume? Well, it is the knowledge that in an uncertain future, they may no longer be able to produce enough to meet their consumption needs. They know deep down that they need to secure a supply of goods and services in the future to support their consumption needs. One potential solution to this dilemma is to warehouse the goods that they produce. Unfortunately, most goods have a short shelf life and cannot be stored for long enough to provide for a secure future. This is why the savers need a good marketable store of value. Historically, that store of value has been gold and silver, but gold and silver have been replaced with paper currency. So let's base the rest of our discussion on the role of paper currency as the current store of value that the modern world has chosen. The savers will hand over their surpluses to the debtors. We can call these goods present goods because they are available in the present for consumption. The debtors, in return, will provide value to the savers in the form of a promise of delivery of future goods. In short, this is credit. Credit is precisely what modern paper currency is. It is the promise of the delivery of goods in the future. The savers will accumulate credit over time, which they will consider assets to be used in the future to obtain the goods and services they need. The debtors will accumulate debt over time. This debt is a liability, which is a future net drain on their production. The credit assets can take many forms. It can exist as paper currency, bonds, or stock. Yes, even stock is a credit instrument when you consider how corporate finance works. When a company needs money, it can either borrow from the bond market or it can sell stock. Either way, the result is that the company receives present goods in exchange for the promise of delivery of future goods. A stock, therefore, is simply a promise of future goods and is thus a credit instrument just like a bond. Other assets might include promises made in the form of pension benefits in the future which are granted in return for current services. Regardless of the type of credit that is accumulated by the savers, there will be an equal liability on the debtor side. So by using this broad definition of credit, we know that the total debt will always be equal to the total credit. It doesn't matter if the credit is in the form of currency, bonds, stock, or the promise of a pension. The assets of the saver represent the liability of the debtor. So why is this a problem? As long as the debtors can honor their obligations, then the savers have achieved their objective in securing for themselves the desired future stream of consumable goods, right? Well, in a perfect world that is true, but in principle there are problems that may surface unexpectedly and at very inconvenient times. Let's take a look at the U.S. credit market as an example of the credit-debt dynamic. Here we see how total U.S. credit has expanded since Nixon closed the gold window. U.S. total debt has expanded 4.8% per year since 1972 at a fairly uniform rate. Currently, the total U.S. debt stands at about $60 trillion, of which only a quarter is the official federal debt. The rest is made up of state and local borrowing, mortgages, revolving credit, and corporate debt. You can see the percentages in the graph at the bottom. 60 trillion is a huge figure when you compare it against the entire US GDP, which is about $15 trillion. Compared to the value of all of the goods produced by the US in a given year, total debt is about 4 times that. To make matters worse, the total U.S. debt does not even include the unfunded promises that have been made, which stand at approximately $142 trillion. When those are included, we can see that total credit, including pensions and Social Security, is about 13 years' worth of goods production. Because only a fraction of this debt is owed to foreigners, many state that we owe it to ourselves and therefore the debt is not a problem. Is this true? Let's ignore the domestic versus foreign issues and go back to our saver versus debtor classification. According to the previous slide, when we just consider U.S. debt, we know that the debtors owe the creditors $60 trillion worth of future goods. This is an explicit obligation. They have also made $142 trillion worth of pensions, Social Security, and medical promises to the savers. But this is only 13 years worth of domestically produced goods and services. So long as the debtors can provide the necessary flow of goods and services in the future, then the savers can safely assume that their assets will serve their needs, right? Well, let's examine this a little more closely. From the analysis of total U.S. debt, we know that it recently has been growing at $3 trillion per year. So as far as interactions with the U.S. are concerned, the savers are producing about $3 trillion worth of present goods over and above their consumption needs, which they are then providing to the debtors in the U.S. in return for credit. The debtors are consuming $3 trillion worth of present goods over and above what they produce. We know that U.S. debtors cannot be producing any more than the U.S. GDP of $15 trillion, but let's make a generous assumption and give the U.S. debtors credit for producing 100% of the GDP. If this is the case, then the U.S. consumers are consuming $3 trillion per year more than this amount, which would bring the maximum consumption rate of the debtors to $18 trillion. Now here's where the analysis gets fun. Suppose the creditors intend to use their savings to provide for future consumption in their old age. In other words, what if they want to get paid back in a reasonable amount of time? Say 20 years. Well, the first thing that will be needed is for credit to be cut off. The flow of present goods will need to be reversed. The debtors will need to provide $10 trillion a year worth of present goods to the savers in order to pay off the implicit and explicit debts within 20 years. In return, their debt balance will be reduced by the same amount. In order to do this, the debtors, who may have enjoyed a consumption rate as high as $18 trillion per year, but probably much less than that, would have to reduce their consumption rate by at least 55%. Can they do it? In principle, yes. But is it a reasonable expectation? I would argue no. After all, if debtors have been accumulating $3 trillion worth of explicit debts every year, then this was at least a consumption rate that was 20% higher than their production rate, and likely to be much, much higher. And this has been going on for 40 years, which is more than a generation. In other words, we have an entire generation of debtors who have become accustomed to living well over their ability to produce. The chances of them cutting their lifestyle by more than 50% is slim to none. What does this mean for the savers? Well, it means that the assets that they thought they had are not going to be honored. They will have to continue producing for themselves to provide for their own consumption needs in the future. Maybe they'll be able to get some value for what they thought was their savings, but it will be pennies on the dollar. So what are the practical implications of all this? Let's look at Detroit as a microcosm of the problem. Detroit just declared bankruptcy. The city had a total of $18.3 billion worth of explicit debt in the form of municipal bonds. The number of occupied households is 264,000. So, the municipal debt per household was $69,000. The median value of an occupied house was $71,000, and the median household income was $27,900. This means that every household's share of the city's debt was about the same value as the house itself, and 2.5 times the earning power of the people living there. And this doesn't even consider the household's personal debt. Is it any wonder the city crumbled? So who are the savers who will be impacted by this? Well, we have present and past city workers who will probably not get the $9.4 billion worth of pension and medical coverage that they were counting on. There are also an estimated 100,000 creditors some of whom are institutions and some are individuals who will find that the savings that they were counting on will just not be there. Now, without going into judgments here about the cast of characters involved in this mess, we can learn an important lesson from all this. Paper is credit, whether it be cash, bonds, stocks, or pensions, and credit is not a reliable store of value. Therefore, paper securities are not a good way to save for the future. So, where does that leave us? What can the saver put his faith in to save for future consumption needs?